Welcome back to Inclusive Design 24, 2021, brought to you in partnership with our Platinum supporters, Intopia, Fable, Arc, and Adobe, and our Gold supporter, Tetralogical. You can follow us on Twitter at ID24Conf, and if you have questions for the presenters, tweet them using the ID24 hashtag for our Q&A at the end of the session. I'm excited to be joined by our guest host, Lucy Greco. So Lucy, over to you.
Thank you, Adrian. I am really excited to be with you all this evening and to present to you Amy June Heinlein, who's going to give us a presentation on 99 Red Balloons. I love the name, Beyond Alt Text. And take it away, Amy.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. So I do have captions running for folks or live transcripts. But I want to thank everyone for coming to the talk where I talk about alternative text. On the opening slide, you can see that there are some red balloons floating in the air against a blue sky. There are also links on the deck. One of them will take you to the slide deck. That's bit.ly/ID2499 balloons, and those are all lowercase letters. And then there's a link to view AI transcripts through Thyssen as well, and that's bit.ly/99 balloons transcript. And I spelled balloons wrong, so of course I did, so I'll spell that for you. That's 99 BALLONS dash transcript. Sorry about that. I like to run transcripts. They aren't perfect because they are AI. Captions fall off the screen. So with transcriptions, you can scroll back a little bit and have history in case you missed something. And as a hard of hearing person myself with audio processing issues, I really appreciate transcripts. And then the last bit of housekeeping is, given the nature of the talk, there are a lot of images. Some do not add any value to the content, and they're for fun more than anything. I do provide alternative text if you follow along in the slide deck. And to illustrate the challenges of lack of alternative text or incomplete alt text, there's a section of images I don't verbally describe the first time, and this will make a little bit more sense later in the presentation. My name is Amy June. That's title camel case, altogether one Amy June. Heinlein, I use the pronoun she and her. I am the open source community ambassador for Canopy Studios. You can find me most places at Volkswagen Chick, that's VOLKSWAGEN. And that name comes from my love of air-cooled Volkswagens and working on air-cooled Volkswagens in a previous lifetime. I help organize and market Accessibility Talks, A11Y Talks. It's a virtual online meetup where we have speakers and guests talk about all things accessibility. I am a mentor across several open source projects, including WordPress and Drupal. And I'm a hospice nurse by trade. I've only been in tech for 5 or 6 years. So I understand how some folks can have trouble accessing digital assets, even things that we might consider simple, like checking email or bank balances. And accessibility is so important to maintain privacy and security. And in this slide, there's a headshot of me, a blonde woman in a blue scarf. Like I said, Canopy brings me here today. We are an open source website strategy, design, development, and support agency, and we're hiring. We specialize in Drupal and WordPress, and we love to have more folks on board who are passionate about inclusivity on the web, because we know that a web is not inclusive if it's not accessible. And then the last part, I am on Ohlone lands tonight, and I'm going to quote Northwestern University, and they said, "It's important to understand the long-standing history that has brought you to reside on the land and to seek to understand your place within history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historic context. Colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation." So what are we going to talk about tonight? I'm going to go over really quickly what accessibility is, some terms and definitions, image types. I'll talk about alt text examples. I'll go into a little bit of social media, and then I'll also talk about some resources and tools. So terms and definitions. I'm going to breeze through these since I'm sure a lot of folks already know them, but I don't want to assume anyone's level of knowledge either. So there's the ADA, which is the American with Disabilities Act. This prohibits discrimination and guarantees that people with disabilities have the same opportunities as everyone else in mainstream American life. Section 508 requires federal agencies to develop, procure, maintain, and use information and communications technology that's accessible to people who live with disabilities, regardless of whether or not they work for the federal government. And Bill C-81 is the Accessible Canada Act. That's an act to ensure a barrier-free Canada to Parliament. And this bill aims to benefit all Canadians, especially those who live with disabilities. And then the final one on this slide is the W3C, which is the Wide World Consortium. It's an international community that develops open guidelines to ensure quality and growth of the web. And the W3C has developed the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, that's WCAG, and this is really a set of guidelines to normalize how we measure accessibility internationally. And I have who is primarily intended for listed on the slide. Web content developers, web authoring tool developers, web accessibility evaluation and tool developers, and others who want or need a standard for web accessibility. And there's an infographic here for image icons, wheelchair, sign language, brain, and a person with a cane. The WCAG is broken down into 3 levels, A, AA, and AAA. Each increasing A in the level indicates additional criteria to follow. Level A, this is like your really minimal compliance. If your website does not meet at least this level, then it means that it's exceedingly hard for people with disabilities to use. AA is an acceptable compliance, which means that your website is usable and understandable for the majority of the web. And then there's that AAA, AAA. This is optimal compliance, which means that your website is accessible to the maximum number of users with or without disabilities. And that AAA level really indicates the highest level of usability. POUR is an acronym for high-level principles that describe functional accessibility. I'm not going to read the definitions, but they stand for perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So let's break it down. What makes our content accessible? There's these 4 broad parameters. The first one, we want to make sure it's easy to see, so we accommodate visual needs. The Center for Disease Control reports that about 12 million people who are 40 years and over in the United States alone have vision impairment. That's including 1 million who are blind. But remember, there's other factors like cracked cell screens or glare. And I have an image of Cyndi Lauper with some sunglasses halfway down her nose looking out in the distance. We want to make sure we accommodate motor needs, and make sure that our assets are easy to interact with. This can be for folks who live with palsy from Parkinson's or paraplegia from ALS or an accident. But it could also be folks who are like handling a baby on the BART or on the Caltrain, in a city bus. And here's Joan Jett playing the guitar. We want to make sure that it's easy to hear, so we accommodate auditory needs. This really helps folks who are in noisy environments, as well as our deaf and hard of hearing friends as well. And here we have a picture of the Beastie Boys with a boombox with MCA in the background doing a high jump. The last one I want to mention is we want to make sure that we accommodate cognitive needs. We want to make sure that it's easy to understand. This can include folks who are distracted, have a difficult time focusing. We really want to make sure the experience is as equivalent as possible across all of the things we're not able to control. And here we have an image of the mental health album by Quiet Riot. So there are some success criteria from the WCAG around the use of images that I want to specifically call out. 1.1.1 is non-text content, and I'll read this verbatim. All non-text content that is presented to the user has a text alternative that serves the equivalent purpose. And this would match the level A compliance level. And how do you pass this? You add a text alternative to your image describing the image. And for video and audio, you would use a short description of the media, but ideally provide a transcript. And then when there's a control or input field that's non-text, making sure that that's labeled. There are exceptions to this, which are texts and captions and decorative images, but I have slides dedicated to those later that I'll go over. Criteria 1.4.5 is images of text. Again, verbatim, if the technologies being used can achieve the visual presentation, text is used to convey information rather than images of text. And that's the AA level. And you pass this by using plain text instead of an image. If you have quotes display as text rather than images, and use CSS to style headings as text and navigation menus as text instead of images. And then I also want to note that images of text are subject to guidelines of color contrast as well. And then the last one I'm going to talk about is 1.4.9, which is images of text. This is the same as 1.4.5, but there are no exceptions. And this brings it up to that AAA compliance, that optimal compliance. Assistive technology, simply put, technology that allows and empowers users who live with disabilities, including low vision, cognitive, learning disabilities. It allows them to access information and maintain privacy. It removes the barrier to the internet or digital information. I specifically want to call out screen readers. These are used to listen to the content of the page. It converts text to speech. We should keep in mind that screen readers also do things, they are used along with visuals on the web page, sometimes for folks who have cognitive challenges. And here's a picture of a laptop with a pair of headphones sitting next to it. I don't know if it's me, but as I get older, it seems like websites are getting smaller and smaller, and the fonts are getting smaller and smaller, and I'm always hitting Command++ on my MacBook. Screen magnification software is true to its name. It's used to enlarge the screen content, so it's easier for us to read, especially if we live with partial sight impairment. But it's also used by people who use text-to-speech functionality as well. And here's an image of someone looking through some glasses with the image in the lens slightly magnified. And then there's some more assistive technology that I just want to call out before I get into more about alt text. There's eye tracking. It's a system that monitors eye movement. Accelerators. This is software and functionality that help reduce the effort needed to type or click. Keyboard customization, this includes mapping of keys, assigning shortcuts, setting sticky keys, helping support single hand typing. Some folks use pop-up and animation blockers. There's refreshable braille displays. These are mechanical terminals that display lines of braille by lowering and raising dots dynamically. And then there's reading assistants, and these can be things like, anything to customize font size or spacing. They could hide less relevant parts of content. Sometimes they read the content aloud and highlight the text. And then there's page maps, which display a small image of the entire web page with an indicator highlighting which part of the screen is currently being looked at. WebAIM conducted a screen reader survey to determine how and why users use screen readers, and they found that 92% use a screen reader because they live with a disability. And of those 92%, a huge portion rely exclusively on the screen reader audio alone. And respondents to that same survey indicated that they're slightly more likely to use a mobile app than a website for common online tasks. So this is 51 close to 52% of people use mobile apps, while 48.2 use websites. So now we're getting into images. Why do we love images? For me, I love them because they enhance content, especially for people who live with cognitive or learning disabilities. We include images and media that support and also add to the information and concepts on our page. And then some folks who live with low vision can use images as cues to help find where they are on a page. And then media, especially social media, use images for conversions. Having images on posts lead to a higher click-through rate, which is a higher ROI, which is return on investment. And images can be huge barriers when they're not accessible. When we do have accessible images, they benefit folks who use screen readers. That text alternative can be read aloud or rendered as Braille. People using speech input software, they can put the focus on a button or a linked image, often with a single voice command. The text alternative can be read aloud for people browsing speech-enabled websites. I live rurally, and so this happens to me a lot. On my mobile phone, I have my images turned off, especially for data roaming, or often I have a poor internet connection. And then, of course, when we have alt text, they now become indexable by search engines, so it can get you a higher SEO. And there's lots of different types of images we can add to our sites. I'm going to focus on just a few, including simple, complex, decorative, captions, images of text, groups of images, and image maps. And we'll take a look at these a little closer in the next few slides. Images can also be used as links, they can be used for pagination or anchor links. Images can be logos, they can be decorative. Images can improve usability by making, orientation and elements that are interactive easy to use and recognize. But we do need to be careful when we create alt attributes for image links, because alt attributes now require two things. It must describe the image, and then it must tell the user what activating that image will do. And we'll talk about this again. So the first one I want to talk about is simple images. These are images that convey simple information, and they can usually get away with a short, sweet description of the image. And we need to remember that this is typically invisible to folks who can see the image, but it's exposed to people using those assistive technologies that I went through at the beginning. The description should really just convey the content and functionality of the image as concisely as possible to provide enough access to the content without adding a ton of details. Right now I have an album cover from U2 of War, where we see an image of a young boy in black and white. Headshots are an example of a simple image. In a headshot, we want to make sure that we include the person's name. Regardless if you say the name in the surrounding text, in a headshot you want to say it again. We want to let folks know if they're doing something, if they're holding something, are they leaning against a tree? But we also don't want to over describe them in a headshot, especially if assumptions are made, and those assumptions can be surrounding gender, socioeconomics, race, sexual expression, and identity. We want to leave these descriptions out for individual people unless it's really communicating important information that can't be found any other way. For this image, I would use something like headshot of dead or alive Petersburg reaching out with a black eye patch on. But I want to remind folks that it can be really cumbersome to hear a screen reader repeat headshot, headshot, headshot on a team page, so be mindful of that. Complex images. These are things like graphs, charts, diagrams, and these really have too much information to really be effectively described using that alt text that I described as short and sweet. So instead we want these images to be described, we want them to be described somewhere. And there's a couple ways you can do this. You can use long description. A long description is a more detailed description, that gives us similar information to the image. Generally, it's done by providing a link to a long description page. The alternate content can be presented on the same page with adjacent table data maybe. But we want to ask ourselves, given the current context, what information is this image intended to communicate? And then we want that same information to be provided to people who can't see it. If a long description is used, it can include any sort of structure to communicate the content, including headings, lists, data tables. There is a caveat to using long description. It's not supported by all assistive technology, and it's not supported by HTML5. So do your homework with this. And here we have an image of artists by how many records they sold, and it would be the Eagles sold 1,901,000, Pink Floyd sold, and going on down the list. An infographic is an example of a complex image. These often communicate important image that screen readers aren't able to recognize. So consider removing text from these images and inserting it as live text on the page. If your alt text will need to include all of the text that occurs within the image. And I'll talk about this in a couple of slides. You need to account for layout in an infographic. Be sure to describe the layout if it's necessary. So something like this, we have a concert poster, and it's the Descendants show flyer at the Whiskey for 5 nights. October 8th with Blink 182, October 9th with Lagwagon, October 10th with Strung Out, October 11th with Sensfield, October 12th with Down by Law. And then there's an image of Milo perched on an overflowing toilet reading a newspaper that says everything sucks. Decorative images. If an image is purely decorative and does not convey meaning, there's a couple of ways to tell screen readers to ignore that image. Images can be decorative when they're styling, spacers, corners, borders. They could be illustrative text but not contributing information. And they also can be identified and described by the surrounding text. But I want to be clear, when do we skip writing alternative text? And there's really only 2 situations. The first being that the image provides no important information. The information is already on the page. And it can be considered decorative if its only function is to enhance the appearance. And then, again, the information in the image is repeated nearby. But I want to stress that I think that these instances are rare. You will almost never have an image that doesn't need alt text. When in doubt, it's always better to give more information. And I do want to stress that if that image is on the page to invoke emotion or mood, you're really doing your content consumers a disservice by not describing that. Here we have an image of a border with all the different types of all sorts of different music down the side. We have a record, we have an amp, we have a drum set, we have a cassette, and then we have headphones. Images of text. This is readable text. It's sometimes presented within the image. If the image is not a logo, we want to avoid text in images. But if we do use images of text, the text alternative should contain the same words as in the image, like that complex image of the infographic. Another thing to stress, though, about this is using actual text is so much more flexible than images. You can resize it without losing clarity. People can change the background and text colors, to modify their reading preferences. Images can really become distorted when zoomed in and out. So in those situations where images of text can't be avoided, the alt text must contain the same text as in the image. And right here we have a record cover of Now the 80s 100 Hits. Logos is an example of an image of text sometimes. Assistive technology doesn't always get the difference between logos and other images. So using the word logo helps our content consumers understand why we're using the image. And we want to follow the format of using the organizational name and then the logo. And then like any other types of image, like a logo, you want your alt text to include any words that are in the logo. If your logo is a link, you also need to follow the best practices for linked images too, which is to indicate where the link is going. So right here we have MTV logo, which is music television. And when you select this link, it navigates to the MTV website. Groups of images, multiple images that convey a single piece of information. The text alternative for one image should convey the information for the entire group. Right here we have an image of 5. We have a group of 5 images, and combined they show a star rating. We see this a lot. There are 5 images, 4 are filled in, and 1 is mostly filled in, indicating that overall rating. The text alternative for the first image should say rating 4.7 out of 5 stars, and then all of the other images would have the null attribute. And I just want to be clear that we have an album cover of Fugazi, the self-entitled album, and I personally think this is a 5 out of 5. Image maps, these contain multiple clickable areas. That's kind of fun to say. This can be organizational charts, park maps, decision trees. The text alternative for an image that contains multiple clickable areas should provide an overall context for the set of links, and then each individual clickable area should have alternative text that describes the purpose and destination of the link. So here we have a map of Boulder and all of its record stores with map pins, and the map pins will deliver you to the corresponding shop's website. So again, when we write alternative text for linked images, we never want to mark the linked image as decorative. WCAG level AA requires alt text for images serving as a link. It might be decorative, but it's not, it doesn't seem like it has a function, but you will need to write alt text if the image is a link. And you want to include any and all text in the image, and then consider the surrounding text. You don't want to repeat if the text around the image has what you're conveying. You want to avoid saying things like link to or click to. The screen reader already knows that it's a link. So when we start our images with link to or click to, it's redundant and confusing for those navigating the page. So here we have a map of all the concert halls in San Francisco. The highlighted pin indicates the Fillmore, which reads 4.7 stars out of 5, and the pin will navigate you to the Fillmore's website. CAPTCHAs. These are only slightly annoying. CAPTCHAs stands for Completely Automated Public Turing Test to Tell Computers and Humans Apart. So there's a word in there I didn't know, and I looked it up, the W3C. Turing test is a system of tests designed to differentiate a human from a computer, and it's named after a computer scientist named Alan Turing. So CAPTCHAs basically confirm whether we are human. They can be visual or audio caption challenges, and they're designed to allow humans to process these challenges, but make it harder for machines and bots. Visual CAPTCHAs can't really contain alt text by design, because then why have the CAPTCHA to begin with? I hope that makes sense. Because you've given the bot the answer within the alt text. We always want to provide alternative options like audio or a one-time password for CAPTCHA. Requiring 2 different forms of CAPTCHA on a site ensures that people who can't see or people who live with disabilities will find a way that they can fill out the form. But there needs to be a message to those who rely on text that there's an alternative available. And Google also has options being reCAPTCHA and reCAPTCHA version 2. So be sure to explore the options available and make sure that a person who's using assistive technology is not left behind. So I just want to iterate some do's and don'ts. We don't want to begin with image of, picture of, people already know that you're on an image, so many times the software will announce that and it becomes really redundant. We don't want to use the file name as our alt text, like, image 1.5.6, .jpeg. The technology will read the file name, and this isn't very useful, especially for something like screenshot.jpg. We don't want to be too wordy. We don't want to rely on artificial intelligence to fill out our alt text for us. They hardly ever get it right. We don't want to use a space. We want to use the null, which is two double quotes. And then what do we want to do? We want to provide image descriptions that are meaningful and that people will find useful. So generally that's the purpose of the image, location, any mood enhancing colors, feelings, emotions, are there people present, are there objects present, and what's actively happening in that image. The WCAG documentation is sort of a one-size-fits-all guideline for authoring image descriptions, but we want to keep in mind descriptions need to be responsive to the context in which the image is found. So not all descriptions are created equal. There are times when you want to know that there's through a field with balloons on the ground, and other details like a woman walking through a barbed wire field with smoke from explosions in the background with some balloons on the ground. And this is especially handy for something like a news article or an op-ed piece. Clarify the image's purpose. And here's some fun examples. So this is where I won't be describing the images as they're presented, to kind of give an example of how just a couple of words don't always describe what you're trying to portray. So we have the alternative text Rio. So this image is described with Rio, as well as this image. So let's look again at that first image. It's really Duran Duran's album cover by artist Patrick Nagel. And then that second image is the iconic statue of Christ the Redeemer looking over city of Rio de Janeiro. We have the alt text men with makeup. Oh no, sorry, that's out of order. This is talking heads. Here's an image of talking heads, and here's an image of talking heads. So let's break it down a little bit more. Here we have two newscasters sitting at a desk with Channel 4 News screen behind them. And here we have the band members of Talking Heads wearing colorful yet mismatched patterned outfits. Here's our men with makeup. Here's an image of a man with makeup, and here's another one. So here's Dave Navarro with a smirk and eyeliner on before a Vogue photo shoot. And then we have the members of KISS with full black and white face makeup. Very different pictures of men with makeup. Dead bug. Here's a dead bug. And here's a dead bug. So this first image is really a bug on a leaf carrying a stack of dead bugs on its back. And the second image is a Volkswagen Beetle with a Grateful Dead logo on its hood. How about Cure? So here's a Cure, and here's a Cure. So that first image, is really a syringe in the foreground of pills and blister packs. And then we have The Cure's Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me album with shiny red lips on its cover. And this is my favorite Cure album, if anyone's interested and want to know. Our last example is Flock of Seagulls. So again, here's a flock of seagulls, and here's a flock of seagulls. So that first image is a flock of seagulls flying against a bright blue sky, whereas this is what some people might have imagined, the band Flock of Seagulls posing with 80s style clothes and hairstyles. Carrie Fisher did challenge me to have a flock of seagulls hairstyle while presenting today, but I just didn't have enough Aquanet in my closet. So social media. Alt text is important for social media too. You know, each platform has its own directions for adding alt text to images. So I want to step back and look at that WebAIM survey again. 53.5% of people found social media somewhat accessible, and 16% found it not very accessible at all. And a quick win to bring up those percentages is increasing the accessibility of our images. And there's an easy way to do that. Lots of social media apps provide options to add alt text and captions, but unfortunately they are not enabled by default when you have to go and find them and turn them on. But a quick search on the internet can usually yield some pretty good articles. And like I said, most of the time the apps do have accessibility settings. Here's an image of a screenshot of how to insert alt text into Twitter, which is kind of good for SEO because, you know, your tweet is only, 280 characters, I don't know by heart, but your alt text can contain 1,000 characters. Okay, so we're coming up on time. So now what? Right? And here we have a slide with 3 images indicating change. We need to work with our team. You know, communication is super important. We want to utilize everyone's skill set when we talk about accessibility in general. And for alternative text, we can do a few different things. We can set up style guides and style sheets that define how to do alt text and given certain circumstances and like flavor and tone of your organization. We can make sure that our editors and WYSIWYGs have tooltips and communicate and define what things are. And we want to make sure that our communicators and our content authors and our content editors are trained on how to use the WYSIWYGs too. You could have a nuclear option like alt text as a required field. I love that option. And we have to remember that accessibility is a moving target, you know, especially when we have, after our website is built and we have content authors adding content daily. We have to remember that those folks adding content need to be trained on accessibility best practices as well. So with that, I'm ready to answer questions. Again, the slide link is bit.ly ID 24-99 balloons, and it's spelled wrong. So I need to work on that. And then I really appreciate you taking the time to walk through the 80s with me because this was a really fun presentation. Again, you can find me at Volkswagen Chick, VOLKSWAGENCHICK across all of the medias. And then if you follow along on that slide deck, there are links to tools and resources at the end. So thank you.
Thank you, Amy June. That was a great talk. And I should probably not admit that at one point I almost had a flock of seagulls haircut. Hey, Lucy, do we have any questions?
We do. We have one question asking, now that LongDesk is no longer supported by anything but besides IE, what alternative do you think there is out there?
You know,
I hope I got that question right.
Yeah, I don't have the answer to that, to be honest. And I actually didn't know that it wasn't supported until I wrote this presentation. I'm a big fan of just being transparent and having everything on the page, including that chart and diagram right next to it and having that live text, next to it. I think anything that takes us away from the page that we are is really inconvenient. Yeah.
Okay, if you give me a second, my Twitter just crashed on me right as we were looking at this. So
Sure.
I have a question, if I may, while you're pulling it back up, Lucy. Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
I am curious, Amy June, do you think that using AI to automatically generate text alternatives can be viable, or do you think that's still better off to defer to manual?
Oh, okay. I don't know if you use Facebook, but I was playing
No.
around. I was playing around with Facebook AI the other day, and it was just a joke. It did not convey the information at all. It was an image of my children leaning against a tree at the park with dogs, and it basically said a field with animals. I'm like, well, I've been known to call my kids animals, but it didn't convey the information well at all. So and the thing is too, I talk a lot about decorative images, and we put images in our web pages and in our media for a reason, and sometimes it is to evoke emotion, and I don't think AI can capture that emotion diligently and to the extent that I think is really worthy of using that image.
I appreciate that. Lucy, have you got the
I
Twitters up?
do. And there's just comments about the music, but there is no questions that I can find at this point in time.
Oh, so I can answer a question that someone asked me earlier about screenshots. So they
That'd be
asked me,
awesome.
yeah, they asked me, should I indicate that it's a screenshot? And I thought about this, and I think the answer is yes, especially if you're providing documentation for something technical, you're explaining how to use an interface. When you say that it's a screenshot, and then describe exactly what's in that screenshot, it kind of indicates to that person, using that it is that kind of technical part. I think it just adds a little bit more value.
Excellent. I have a question for you. Is it possible to have a web page with too many images on it?
Well, I think so. And I could be, okay, lots of my friends know how I feel about the internet, and I'm a Luddite by heart. I think that Craigslist is the perfectly themed website. It's simple, it's easy to use. I usually have images turned off in my browser because a lot of times I just want the information. So a good balance would be to say, you can overdo images, especially if you don't have good alt text. I think it depends on your content consumer and how they process information, because it really could come down to how someone processes information.
That's an excellent answer. I really loved your music references, and there's been several comments about that both in the Slack channel and in on Twitter. So your music references really just kept everyone engaged. That's really
Great.
well done.
That's wonderful, because you really put yourself out there sometimes when you talk about the music that you like. So that's great to know.
Well, I'm
This
glad
is
to
a
hear
safe
you have
space.
eclectic tastes. Very eclectic. It's all different styles you use. So
I think that comes from living in the Bay Area too, and always wanting to find something to do. And you can't always, when I was younger, couldn't always find what I wanted. And I found that I had more fun when I expanded my horizons and went to something I wouldn't necessarily have picked. So now, as an older adult, I think that it just makes going out a lot easier.
it does. All right, let me just give one last check on Slack here. Okay, no, I think we've got no more questions.
Great. I had a
All
lot of
right.
fun, and I want to thank the organizers. This is always such a fun event, and it's always challenging to get sleep.
Can confirm, yes. All right.
Amy,
Well, then,
Amy June, you did an excellent job. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. It's nice being
you
with you
did.
again.
Thank you very much. And thank you as well, Lucy. For everyone else, if you liked this session, make sure you hit that YouTube like button. And don't forget, you can subscribe to youtube.com/inclusivedesign24 to be kept in the loop on our future events. A reminder that ID24 is a respectful community, and you can find our code of conduct on the Inclusive Design 24 website. Inclusive Design is brought to you with thanks to our supporters, Intopia, Fable, TPGI ARC, Adobe, Tetralogical, Intuit, InfoAxia, Center for Inclusive Design, Web Directions AAA, Adrian Roselli LLC, and Can Access. Inclusive Design will be back on the hour with our next session. We will see you then.